Welcome to the Report Card with Nat Malkus, where we evaluate research, policy, and education practice efforts to improve the lives of families, schools, and students. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that can raise a lot of eyebrows: for-profit higher education. Now, some for-profit colleges have been pretty heavily criticized for things like recruiting tactics, high debt loads of students, and sometimes lackluster labor outcomes. At the same time, for-profit schools were some of the first to experiment with online education, have been faster to respond to some labor market demands, and have increased access to higher education for people who might not otherwise be able to get a degree. So is this criticism warranted, or can higher education learn something from its for-profit side? To talk about this, I brought in Andy Rosen, Chairman and CEO of Kaplan, Inc., the parent company that used to own Kaplan University. Andy was instrumental in the recent sale of Kaplan University to Purdue University, one of the largest shakeups in higher education in recent years. It's worth listening to this conversation because Andy's take on the for-profit sector is compelling, honest, and maybe not what you'd expect. Here's my conversation with Andy Rosen. Andy Rosen, CEO of Kaplan, Inc., thanks for coming on the podcast.
Good to be here.
So first of all, for our listeners that aren't familiar with you, can you put us into a little context? So you're the CEO of Kaplan, Inc., and that once included Kaplan University, but now Kaplan has become Purdue Global, part of Purdue University. You can't blame listeners for being sort of confused about how this all happened. So are you still in the higher ed business?
Yeah, we are. And let me back up a little bit and say Kaplan, Inc. is a broad, diversified educational services company globally that includes a number of different units. So a lot of people are familiar in this country, for example, with Kaplan Test Prep, right? So if you studied for your SAT or your LSAT, GMAT, you probably went to Kaplan.
And that's your primary brand recognition in the States.
Well, if you talk to different people, they think of Kaplan in different ways. Another unit is Kaplan Professional. So most likely, just as your doctor probably went to Kaplan, your nurse probably went to Kaplan, so did your real estate broker, your securities broker, your insurance broker, your home inspector probably went to Kaplan, a Kaplan program in the workforce. And so
a broker needs to get ready for Series 7. He comes to Kaplan for prep.
That's right. So then in the U.S., you've got Kaplan Higher Ed, and that's the one, we'll probably get to this at some point,
Sure.
But Kaplan Higher Ed, previously the main program institution was Kaplan University. And last year we sold Kaplan University to Purdue University. But Kaplan still provides support for that institution. So we work for Purdue, which now owns that institution.
So you're not out of the business. Great, because if you were, this would be a short podcast.
That's right. We're still in it, and we're still very focused on it. Just to wrap up, and I think we'll probably go back to that, Kaplan International offers professional and higher ed globally. So actually, 2018 sort of marked an important moment for Kaplan. More than half of our business was sourced overseas. So either delivered overseas or students who started overseas and came to the United States.
Kaplan Inc. is a pretty sprawling enterprise.
It's a sprawling enterprise.
Well, let's bring it down to for-profit higher ed and higher ed in general. So I'm going to start off with a couple of sort of tough questions. Let me first say, for-profit higher ed has been a pretty popular punching bag for a couple of years. Don't know if you've noticed, in the press, in the ad. Well, yeah. My first question is, again, not speaking specifically to Kaplan, but just more generally, how much of that is fair? And some of questions about dubious recruitment practices, high tuition, default rates, investors' interest versus student interest, these sorts of things. How much of that criticism has the for-profit side maybe rightly brought on themselves?
I think some of it certainly was deserved. There's two narratives about for-profit education, and you could imagine either one of them emerging as the primary one. One did emerge as the primary one. The alternative narrative is that much of the innovation in higher ed over the last 10 or 20 years really emerged out of the for-profit sector. So, for example, we were in online education for, 18 years or something like that, building an institution, growing institution, refining the model and the technology and so on. And then, I think it was September of 2011 or something like that, the New York Times had that front page story about the, 150,000 students who were taking a robotics or whatever it was course at Stanford. And the world declared that Stanford had invented online learning, at that moment. And as soon as that happened, all of the traditional universities, suddenly that became the thing. Everybody wanted to be part of it. Well, we've been at that for a long time and just encountering withering criticism during that period. I'm not sure it would have happened had the for-profit sector not pushed that forward. Similarly, this notion of, there's a real focus now on work readiness, and our universities really doing the job and making sure that students are connected with the skills they need to be successful in the workforce. And that's something that's been sort of right in the wheelhouse of the for-profit sector for
squarely.
Yeah, squarely in the wheelhouse. And again, I think a lot of what's now viewed as best practice for universities in terms of work readiness emerged directly out of the for-profit sector. And I would add things like, practitioner faculty, convenient locations, reaching out to a non-traditional market, including adults. All of that emerged, I don't want to say solely, but popularized and pushed forward in advance by the for-profit sector. And so over time, the traditional sector adopted a lot of these, but I'm not sure a lot of them would have gone as far or as fast without the for-profit sector. And so as the for-profit sector has been squeezed, more than squeezed, the question for the higher ed sector is who's going to take on that burden of innovation? Because we haven't seen it, at least quite as decisively, out of the traditional higher ed.
It raises a question. So oftentimes I'll talk with my colleague Jason Delisle, who does a lot of higher ed work, and we talk about three axes that people always want universities to do: increase access, have very high quality, and drive down cost. Let's just do all three of those together. Jason often says, you can do two, but you can't do three. It seems to me that perhaps one of the defenses for the for-profit sector is we're pushing access to places where it otherwise hasn't been. Has the for-profit sector been successful in that, and maybe in some cases too successful in driving that access point?
I think it would be a fair argument that any institution that focuses entirely on access is headed for a bad place. You got to combine that with cost issues and also quality. I know it's hard to do all three, but you got to do something of all three. I should probably back up and make clear, I'm no longer part of the for-profit higher education industry. I spent time in it, but when we sold Kaplan University to Purdue, we became a service provider to Purdue, but we're not part of that sector anymore.
Sure.
That doesn't mean I don't continue to have my viewpoint.
Yeah, that's why I wanted you to come on. Yeah, no, but that raises a question. When you're a for-profit school, and you're very different from nonprofits because your purpose is to benefit students, and you don't maybe have this tension between balancing students' interests with, investors' bottom line, right? And there's a tension here in for-profits. But I wonder, is that such a simple tension, or do problems disappear when Kaplan Inc. becomes Purdue Global, or is that sort of a false dichotomy between for-profits and nonprofits?
Well, I would love to be presented with the university or college that isn't highly focused on whether their revenues exceed their expenses or the reverse. Harvard has $40 billion endowment. That $40 billion is the excess of revenue over expenses, whether through donations or other means. Right. That's what's happened over the course of the 300 and whatever it is, 80 years that Harvard's been around.
So that's something of a surplus, we would say.
That is a hell of a surplus.
$40 surplus. It's pretty good.
But, so go talk to any university president, and they're very focused on their budget. And so, again, the flip side to that is, I'm not sure why people seem to think that Apple will continue to try to provide great products, because they know if you provide a great product now, then 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 20 years from now, people will continue to want to buy. And yet, educators, institutions in the for-profit education sector are just going to focus on grabbing a student now and, doing whatever happens. I mean, if you want to be around for decades to come, you've got to build a record of delivering for your students. And that means giving them the education they need to get good jobs and be successful in the workplace, in their careers, and as citizens. I mean, that's what creates the reputation for a university that will support it in the long term. And I think as long as an institution has a long-term orientation, the incentives for quality are paramount.
Sure. That raises an interesting question. And it's hard to understand the actual landscape, because when you see things in the press or that get reported, the big stories are often the ones that are sort of negative. One of these is Argosy University, which closed, left some students scrambling, of course, whenever a university closes. there's stories like these that then get sort of characterized to talk about the sector. And I just wonder, is that fair? Are these closures? We had another one with Corinthian, right? There was a problem. Is that sort of the salacious end of the spectrum and an unfair characterization, or are for-profits maybe less stable than a lot of nonprofit institutions?
Well, I want to respond to the basic point, but I think that I found it interesting, like the Chronicle of Higher Education wrote an article about the Argosy collapse and the Dream Center issue, and the header was for-profit education. I think it's important to note that that institution was owned by a nonprofit. That was a nonprofit institution. Huh. It had previously been owned by Education Management Company, which a couple of years ago sold it to a nonprofit. So its whole life as a for-profit, the bills were paid, the students were served, gotcha. And you could, anybody can have whatever argument they want about which should have been higher quality, less quality, It transferred to a nonprofit. You would think that would have turned it into a fine institution with all the right incentives. 2 years later, they found it to be a pretty hard business, and it collapsed, and it collapsed in a way that left a lot of students on the street very suddenly. That was not a for-profit issue. That
was it's just not attributable to the for-profit.
Yeah, I mean, the designation change didn't change the fact that that was not an institution that had whatever business model it needed in order to succeed. Having said that, there obviously have been for-profits that have collapsed, as there have been nonprofit institutions that have collapsed. And I think that anybody who pays attention to where higher ed is going, and I presume listeners of this podcast probably do, know that we should expect more institutions to falter over the course of the next couple of decades. Clay Christensen has his famous prediction that half of today's colleges and universities will be out of business in the next 15 years. I think he may have made that 15 years ago. So,
it's an evergreen prediction. Just reset the clock.
But I think most people do sort of acknowledge that it's going to be some shaky times going forward for a lot of institutions, and clearly not just for-profits. I think the for-profits may be the most vulnerable because they're younger institutions without this kind of brand and sort of staying power that some of the traditionals have. But the water is rising, and I think it's going to start to take down a lot of institutions.
Well, let me ask you, because community colleges have a whole different plight. But as far as, when you look at the outcomes of community colleges, 3-year graduation rates and so forth, their outcomes are not looking real shiny. Community colleges have a tough road to hoe, but of course, most of them have the state to back them up. And so they don't have sort of a profit and loss sheet that is fueled by private revenue. I mean, if they were on the same footing, do you think we'd see more criticism of community colleges along the same line? And I just wonder if what we're missing is the fact that you may just not have to be as efficient and profitable if you are not depending on private revenue.
Well, I think that community colleges' outcome measures are ones that people can point fingers at, but they're serving a very difficult population. Right. It is often analogous to the population that the for-profits are serving. And so I have tremendous empathy for the community colleges that are doing a good job serving the students that they, the demographic that they serve, but are doing it, with better outcomes than others. At the same time, there are community colleges, like there are in every sector, who are doing a worse job than average. And it's obviously the case that tends to get less scrutiny than maybe the entirety of the for-profit sector, even those who are doing the job really well.
Yeah, well, there's a convenient name for the for-profit sector that sort of helps you generalize about it. You call it for-profit. Hey, let's look at the other side of the coin for a minute. You said innovation was one successful area where for-profits have made progress. What are some other successes that the for-profit sector has demonstrated?
Well, I think the use of data to govern a business model. So what kinds of students are likely to be successful? How do we anticipate which students might have problems over time? That's something that I think the for-profits have really pioneered. And even the common curriculum is something that kind of makes sense. Look, I understand the top 250 universities in the country. It's really important that each professor has discretion to create her own syllabus and curriculum and teach it and so on. But as you work your way down, there is at least some merit to the notion of a group of faculty coming together, pooling best practices, putting together a common curriculum for a course, and teaching that to make sure that you don't have the kind of wide disparities that you might otherwise have. And I think the for-profits have certainly pioneered that.
So what particular types of things do you think that traditional universities now really stand to continue to learn, and maybe lessons learned, best practices, general approaches to higher ed that are just less commonplace in the nonprofit sector?
One of the interesting things about higher ed is that there's much less of a growth motivation than you have in most markets in this country. And in fact, I don't know when it was, in the 30s or 40s or 50s, higher ed just decided that it was perfection, that the model was exactly right. And therefore, any variation from what was being done was by definition worse. And part of that is we shouldn't grow. We should stay the same size. And without that motivation to grow, you also kind of relax the motivation to improve so that you can attract more students or to innovate, to try to differentiate, to try things differently. In fact, universities famously try to look more like each other as opposed to most other markets where companies tend to try to differentiate themselves and look a little different from the next. And I think that the for-profits came in, they clearly were finding a market. A lot of universities started to sort of learn some of the lessons of the for-profits. People tend to look at the for-profits and say, this is what they are. They will always be exactly like this, when in fact what you've had was a very dynamic group of institutions that were slated, I think, to evolve and get better, as happens in many markets. Instead, the sector sort of got choked off and didn't get a chance to evolve in the way that I think it would have been healthy for the company. Again, I don't want to be dismissive in the least of bad behavior and including incentives for bad behavior that existed in the for-profit sector, but I think that unusually among markets, people focused on the bad behavior and decided that defined the marketplace.
Sure. Well, it should also be noted that for-profits aren't the only target for criticisms. For instance, in this latest admissions scandal, I don't think there was a single for-profit on the list that were being paid tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars to get admission.
Yeah, and to be fair, I think the for-profits sometimes feel like they're getting picked on, but if you talk to any university president, they're feel like they're constantly getting attacked, and it's justifiable. I mean, there's reasonability to that because a lot of taxpayer money is flowing through these institutions, and there's a need for accountability. It's appropriate. I mean, not many markets, if you're selling a car, you can't ask the taxpayer to help subsidize the loans that are providing it. And I've never been a libertarian on this topic. I think that higher education, generally for-profit education, needs to have regulation. It's just the nature of the regulation that is, I think, sometimes a little misguided.
Well, let me ask you about that, because there has been a particular focus, arguably in the Obama years, and these issues continue to play out, where we should focus regulation on gainful employment and so forth on the for-profit sector. And there's other folks who have said, look, regulation should be regulation across universities. And so, I wonder, where do you sort of see the appropriate balance for-profit schools in a regulatory framework? Should they be treated just like nonprofit universities, or might there be sort of special circumstances so that, actually federal regulation, data gathering, that sort of thing should have a tailored bent?
Well, I guess I'd say the default ought to be common regulation across all sectors, right? So if you're trying to protect students and taxpayers, protect students and taxpayers. But there could be circumstances where you need some different treatment for different types of institutions, but that should be based on a specific problem that you're trying to solve. And I guess one of the issues that I had when we were part of the for-profit sector,
right,
and I still bugs me, is a lot of the regulation that I've seen has really been about just punishing as opposed to trying to solve problems. And one of the underlying assumptions is, and you alluded to it earlier, is if you're trying to make money for shareholders, you therefore are going to slavishly follow, whatever will get as much money into your shareholders' pockets as soon as possible. And you're not going to care about anything else. And we talked about the sort of time horizon, but implicit in that is that for-profits are entirely governed by incentives. If that's true, why not just create a system that creates incentives for good behavior? Why not enable an institution to get more funding if its outcomes are at a certain level and less if they're below a certain level? Instead of just saying, we don't like the sector, we're going to just make it as hard as possible for them to operate. We're going to put as many clamps as possible, nudge them in the right direction. And if they are as devoted to the almighty dollar at every moment as you think, then use that to help incentivize innovation and incentivize good outcomes and good behavior.
Sure, the outcomes you want to see. Okay, so let's turn the page here. I want to talk about Purdue Global and Kaplan. So Kaplan Inc. sold Kaplan University to Purdue University. What were the value propositions from the Kaplan side and from, Mitch Daniels' side? Because a lot of folks would say Mitch Daniels, president of Purdue University, took a brave step in this direction. It's not a common thing. So what was the value proposition? Why did this purchase work?
Well, I think it made a lot of sense for both institutions. And I would start with, we talked earlier about Clay Christensen's prediction about schools, half of the schools going out of business.
And the tendency for state universities to look like other state universities,
yes,
right?
That's right. I think at Kaplan, we sort of had to have the conversation, if you really believe that a lot of institutions are going to go out of business, what is it that makes us believe that we will be among the survivors in this vast wreckage that will take place over the next 20 or 30 years? And as an aside, Kaplan is part of a company, Graham Holdings, used to be called the Washington Post Company, that's very long-term oriented. And so we literally do think in terms of decades, not about 2022 or 2025, but 2040 and 2050. And so over that kind of period, is it reasonable for us to think that we'll be among the survivors? And there were a number of reasons that led us to think the answer to that is yes.
Well, I'm curious, so let's get to a couple of those specific liabilities. Where were the fears lodged?
Frankly, I think it is the responsibility of the leader of any institution to be thinking about that issue. So I think that there are quite a few institutions in this country that are sort of the next president away from being on the bubble. Many institutions, if they have the right leadership and the right strategy, can survive. But many others, if they drift and they don't adapt to the world that's coming, they're in trouble. Now, Georgetown is not in trouble. They could have a string of lousy presidents and they will be fine.
Harvard's going to be okay. Right?
Harvard, I think, will make it by.
Just checking.
So there's some that really don't have to worry about this. They're so far up in the mountain that those rising waters, we'll never get to them. Or at least not in the lifetime of anybody, the grandchildren of anybody who's around today. But if you're a relatively new institution, you're a for-profit, you're dealing with sector liability and that kind of thing, you have to ask that question. And as I say, many institutions ask that question. Our outcomes were excellent in terms of, the graduation rates at double the rate of the rest of American higher education. If all of American higher ed had the outcome measures of Kaplan University for the demographics we serve, there'd be 800,000 more graduates a year in the United States. And by the way, the taxpayer would pay $40 billion less. So as an aside, that's an institution you'd think governmental officials would say, let's talk to them. Let's see what are they doing right?
We could double Harvard's endowment every year with that kind of savings. I mean, that's incredible.
That would be a great use of that money.
Sorry, Harvard. We're not trying to pick on you.
Yeah. So we thought Kaplan University was very nimble, was very responsive to market trends, working closely with employers, and so on. A lot of reasons to think it could survive, but you're coming from behind. So we were thinking about those issues as, at the same time, Purdue was thinking about the land-grant mission. In the 1860s, the land-grant mission was literally, let's have a college in Indiana so that farmers and mechanics and so on in the state of Indiana could have a place to go without having to get on a wagon and go all the way out to the Northeast. So that was a really important mission at the time. Mitch Daniels and the board of directors of Purdue were thinking about what is the 21st century land-grant mission, and they really felt that serving working adults who do not have access to the excellence of American higher education was a really important mission that they were sort of constitutionally obligated to address. They also felt that they were well behind in online. And those two things, they actually worked very hard on how can we as Purdue address those issues, and in a dose of humility that you don't always find, determined that they really probably couldn't solve internally.
Not building from scratch.
Building from scratch, right. So we had this great institution and platform and set of capabilities. And Purdue had a need for exactly those capabilities. And we connected on that. And it was pretty quick that the two sides said, this just makes sense. And we wouldn't have done it with very many institutions. That is, Purdue was genuinely committed and strategically committed to the kinds of students that we were serving. It wasn't just like, hey, how can we make more revenue? Or how can we be cool and have online and so on? They really strategically wanted to be in this world, and they're run in a very rational way. And that, anybody who knows Mitch Daniels knows that he's really focused on outcomes and on what is the purpose of, in this case, higher ed. I mean, as president of Purdue, he focused on the kinds of things the country would want a university president to be focused on, not on, how can we make ourselves more elite, more scarce, more prestigious, but rather, how can we serve the community that funds us and established us?
Yeah, I think there's two interesting things here. I mean, one is to consider the fact that, to hear you tell it, and I believe your take, that you have a for-profit and a non-profit institution whose sense of mission was not so differentiated that you couldn't be brought together in common cause.
That's right.
The other question is that you really complemented what Purdue needed. Now, part of that was online, but part of that is spread out campuses, right? I mean, just when you sold, how many Kaplan University campuses were they? What was your geographic imprint?
Yeah, so let me just address the first point. That is the cultural fit.
Right.
Again, people create cartoons of what a for-profit institution is and what a public institution is. And the reality is you had here a for-profit institution that was very focused on the long term, very focused on quality, very focused on trying to do the right thing. I mean, I say that maybe immodestly, but that happens to be true. And our people come to work with us because of those things. And you had a public institution that is very tightly run, very strategic, thoughtful. The people on both sides got along immediately. The lawyers got along with the lawyers, the finance people got along with the finance people. And I think that cultural fit is really important, because when you're trying to put two institutions together, what I think most people worried about or predicted was that there would be an explosion. And we haven't seen that explosion, but it's because we were very careful about it all along. And because we very confident we chose the right partner. And I think Purdue feels the same way. Going to your second point, Kaplan University has campuses or learning centers, but only 13 of them. They're not big, broad campuses. They're small, typically locations where students can come to check in, to talk with an advisor, and so on. There's some classes in there, but it's predominantly an online institution. Yeah, and it is not part of the strategy to add a lot of campuses.
Right. One thing that came up in the press when this sort of made public, a lot of people said, man, Mitch Daniels is taking a risk here. Purdue is a pretty prestigious university, very solid reputation. They're going to pull on this for-profit, and that's going to sully their reputation. Has that proven true? Has there been struggles with that? Has it gone smoothly? How's it progressed, at least in sort of public sentiment, as far as you can tell?
Yeah, look, Mitch Daniels deserves the plaudits he's gotten. I mean, he did take a risk, and there are not that many university presidents who have had the courage to do it. But I think he and his team went through a very, very detailed due diligence process. And they focused on fact, not on the churn that takes place, whenever something interesting happens. I think that at Purdue, they recognized that anything new is going to get a lot of attention, and often negative attention. And I think that culturally that institution and that organization focuses on what is the reality and what is right for our institution. And that's what they did here. As I say, that culturally the new institution is working well. We are a service provider now. The institution is governed by Purdue, reports into the Purdue Board of Directors. We have ideas about things, but the decision-making takes place in West Lafayette. Sometimes that's hard, but that's got to be the way it is. And that's another reason why you got to find the right partner, because we feel like their vision of this was consistent with our vision. Our job is to make sure that over time, Mitch Daniels looks like a genius, and I think that the history will reflect that.
And you feel like you're on your way. That's good. So let me return back to you, Andy, before we cut you loose here. You aren't a for-profit guy anymore. You were a for-profit guy, in the higher ed space, and now you're not. What difference does that make to you? I mean, what does the change in sectors illustrate in your experience?
Well, yeah, I mean, some people have asked this because actually we're now a competitor with for-profits. So, the more regulation on for-profits, the better it is for us in some general sense. But I genuinely feel that the country needs diversity in its higher education offerings. And the for-profit sector does bring some different approaches that benefits the system as a whole. And a proper regulatory environment that enables that to happen while minimizing. You can't eliminate the problems. I mean, there are problems throughout higher ed and throughout our society. You're not going to be able to eliminate all of them. But a proper regulatory environment could limit the downside and yet allow the kind of innovation and fresh thinking that the for-profit sector provides. And I think that's what would be best for this country over the next, 50 years or 100 years, is to have a thriving for-profit sector alongside a traditional sector that is, already as a group, the best in the world.
Andy Rosen, thank you for coming in. Appreciate it. I know that while you were a for-profit guy, you sometimes took some licks for being in the for-profit sector. Thanks for coming on the report card to take a few more for your old compadres.
Glad to be here. It was fun.
Thanks for listening to the report card. And special thanks to Andrew Rosen for coming on the podcast. This episode wouldn't be possible without the help of our producers. That includes Sophia Gallo, Macy Heath, Brendan Bell, Gage Hurley, and Cody Christensen. The report card now has a standalone page on iTunes. Please go there and please rate us. It helps other folks hear about the podcast. You can also subscribe on Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or whatever your favorite podcast player is. If you have any questions, comments, or topic suggestions for future episodes, reach out to us at ed.podcast@aei.org. Until next time, I'm Nat Malkus.